In just 53 seconds, Judge Aileen Cannon confidently rejected Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's legal argument with a dismissive wave of her hand. But what happened next left the entire Florida federal courthouse in stunned silence. The legal counter Crockett delivered without raising her voice or breaking her professional demeanor would fundamentally transform one of the most closely watched judicial proceedings in American history. The Southern District of Florida courtroom gleamed with polished oak and brass fixtures that morning. Sunlight streamed through high windows, casting theatrical rays across the federal seal mounted behind the bench. The room had the sterile perfection of a place where power was accustomed to speaking without interruption, where difference wasn't just expected, but demanded. This wasn't merely another day in court. This was the culmination of months of legal maneuvering in a case with profound implications for judicial independence and the rule of law itself. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Legal analysts, journalists, and citizens who had lined up before dawn to witness what many believed would be a routine ruling favoring the judge's established position. Jasmine Crockett sat at the counsel table, her posture reflecting focused determination rather than anxiety. The navy suit she wore seemed carefully chosen, professional, understated, appropriate for the serious nature of the proceedings. Her legal materials were arranged with methodical precision, color-coded tabs extending from key documents, each page of case law annotated with her own careful handwriting. From her elevated position at the bench, Judge Aileen Cannon projected absolute certainty. Appointed to the federal judiciary in 2020, her controversial rulings had already drawn national attention. Today, her tone carried the confidence of someone unaccustomed to being challenged effectively in her own courtroom. What neither the judge, the packed gallery, nor the millions following updates online could anticipate was that Congresswoman Crockett, a former defense attorney before entering Congress, had identified something in the judicial record that everyone else had missed, a precedent so precisely applicable, so legally sound that it would be impossible to dismiss without undermining the very foundations of judicial consistency. In less than 1 minute, the legal landscape of this landmark case would be completely transformed by a woman who had prepared more thoroughly, researched more diligently, and understood the law more precisely than anyone else in that imposing room. If you value seeing preparation, triumph over position, and believe in the power of meticulous legal reasoning to uphold justice, make sure to like this video and subscribe. What you're about to witness isn't just a courtroom confrontation. It's a masterclass in how thorough preparation can change the course of legal history. In less than 5 minutes before stepping into that Florida courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had built her reputation on a foundation of meticulous preparation and principled advocacy. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center with honors, she had distinguished herself as a criminal defense attorney who mastered not just the law, but its practical application in courtrooms where the odds were rarely in her client's favor. The court remains unconvinced by counsel's novel interpretation of the statute. Judge Cannon announced her tone carrying the slight edge of someone accustomed to having the final word. The precedents cited do not apply to the unique circumstances of this case. The gallery responded with the subtle rustle of notebooks and the muted tapping of reporters on smartphones. Legal commentators exchanged knowing glances. The ruling appeared to be proceeding exactly as most had predicted. What they couldn't see was the calm calculation behind Crockett's composed expression. For 17 days, she had devoted every available hour to researching Judge Cannon's complete judicial record. Not just her public rulings, but the detailed reasoning in her written opinions. The precedents she consistently relied upon, and most importantly, the specific legal principles she had established in similar cases. Your Honor, before you finalize this ruling, I respectfully request the opportunity to address a directly relevant precedent that bears significantly on today's decision, Crockett said, her voice clear and measured. Judge Cannon's slight frown conveyed both surprise and mild irritation at the interruption. Counsel, we've exhaustively covered the relevant case law. What precedent could possibly have been overlooked? One authored by you, Your Honor, Crockett replied. The subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere was palpable. Journalists, who had been half listening while preparing their predetermined headlines, suddenly focused their complete attention on the exchange. What the public didn't yet know was that 3 days earlier, Crockett had made a critical discovery while reviewing Judge Cannon's complete judicial history. In a case with remarkably similar legal questions but different political implications, Judge Cannon had ruled using reasoning that directly contradicted her current position. The case had received little attention at the time, but its legal principles were identical to the issues now before the court. Your Honor, in United States v. Morales, decided by this court 14 months ago, you established a principle that is directly applicable to our current matter, Crockett continued. The slight widening of Judge Cannon's eyes was barely perceptible, but to seasoned courtroom observers it spoke volumes. It was the look of a judge suddenly realizing that an attorney had identified something significant, something she hadn't anticipated being raised. In Morales, you held, and I quote from page 17 of your opinion, that when executive authority conflicts with established judicial precedent, the court must defer to the president regardless of the executive's asserted interest in the matter. The gallery remained silent, but the atmosphere had transformed. Court reporters stopped typing, their fingers suspended above keyboards as they processed the potential implications of what they were hearing. Judge Cannon's expression remained professionally neutral, though her fingers now gripped her pen with noticeably more pressure. Morales involved distinct factual circumstances, she responded, her tone measured but with a new undercurrent of caution. With respect, Your Honor, Crockett replied, while the facts differ, the legal principle you established is directly applicable. In your Morales opinion, you specifically wrote that this principle transcends the particular circumstances of this case and establishes a standard for all similar jurisdictional questions. The precision of the quotation left no room for ambiguity. Judge Cannon had indeed written those words, establishing a legal principle that she was now preparing to contradict. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't just the identification of the contradiction, but the methodical way Crockett had prepared to address it. On the table before her lay not just the Morales opinion, but a detailed analysis comparing the judicial reasoning in that case with the current proceedings, highlighting 7 specific points where the legal questions were identical despite the different contextual circumstances. Social media was already erupting with reactions as legal analysts in the courtroom discreetly messaged colleagues. Cannon contradiction began trending within minutes. Law professors sent urgent texts to their students. Watch this proceeding. This is what thorough preparation looks like. Judge Cannon took a measured breath, her judicial temperament now fully engaged. Counsel, I'm familiar with my ruling in Morales. However, there are distinguishing elements between these cases that make the comparison imperfect. I anticipated Your Honor might see it that way, Crockett responded, her tone respectful but resolute. That's why I've prepared a detailed analysis identifying the 7 core legal questions present in both cases. With the court's permission, I'd like to address them specifically. It was the perfect setup, not confrontational, but thoroughly prepared, not challenging the judge's authority, but methodically demonstrating the legal inconsistency that was about to unfold. Judge Cannon, a jurist known for her careful attention to legal procedure, found herself at a pivotal crossroads that would test her commitment to judicial consistency. You may proceed, Counselor, she said, her tone now reflecting the seriousness with which she took the challenge before her. What followed would become one of the most remarkable examples of legal advocacy in recent court history. A masterclass in how thorough preparation can reveal inconsistencies that even the most powerful legal minds cannot dismiss. Thank you, Your Honor. Crockett began standing at the lectern with a calm authority that commanded the courtroom's complete attention. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the complexity of these legal questions in your court's consistent commitment to judicial integrity. The strategic acknowledgement wasn't mere flattery. It was the establishment of the standard by which the coming analysis would be measured. Judicial integrity required consistent application of legal principles regardless of the parties involved. In Morales, she continued, this court considered whether the executive branch could assert privilege that would override established judicial precedent. Your Honor ruled correctly, in my view, that executive privilege must yield to judicial precedent in matters where the separation of powers is at stake. Judge Cannon nodded slightly, her expression revealing nothing, as Crockett methodically laid the foundation for what was to come. I've prepared a document comparing the core legal questions in Morales with our current case, Crockett said, signaling to her associate who distributed copies to the court clerk and opposing counsel. You'll note that I've included direct quotations from Your Honor's Morales opinion alongside the parallel issues in our present matter. The document was a masterpiece of legal comparison, clean, precise, annotated with specific page references, and structured to make the similarities impossible to dismiss. Court observers would later describe it as the most methodically prepared legal comparison they had seen in years of covering federal proceedings. The first parallel concerns jurisdictional authority, Crockett explained, her finger tracing the document as Judge Cannon reviewed it. In Morales, Your Honor wrote, "This court cannot abdicate its responsibility to apply established legal precedent merely because the executive branch asserts a novel interpretation of its authority." The words hung in the air. Cannon's own judicial philosophy crystallized in a single sentence that now stood in direct opposition to the ruling she had been prepared to issue. In our current case, Crockett continued, we face an identical question of whether novel executive interpretation can override established precedent. The legal principle is indistinguishable, even if the specific executive actions differ. Judge Cannon's expression remained professional, but courtroom veterans noticed her posture shift subtly. The slight straightening of the spine that indicated full intellectual engagement with a serious legal challenge. The second parallel addresses the question of harm. Crockett proceeded in Morales. Your Honor held that speculative harm to executive functions cannot outweigh concrete harm to judicial integrity. That principle directly applies to the government's current argument regarding potential harm. As Crockett methodically worked through each of the 7 parallels, the courtroom atmosphere transformed. What had begun as routine proceedings now carried the electric tension of witnessing legal history in the making. Journalists abandoned their pre-written stories and started anew, capturing the extraordinary methodical dismantling of judicial inconsistency happening before them. The third parallel is perhaps most directly relevant, Crockett said, her voice maintaining the same measured tone despite the growing impact of her presentation. In Morales, Your Honor specifically rejected the argument that unique political circumstances justified departure from established precedent. You wrote, and again I quote directly, "The rule of law demands consistency of principle regardless of the political implications or the identity of the parties before the court." The quotation struck at the heart of the current proceedings, where the political implications loomed large over the legal questions. By citing Judge Cannon's own articulation of judicial principle, Crockett had created a perfect bind. Either maintain consistency with her previous ruling or explicitly contradict her own established judicial philosophy. Judge Cannon's legal acumen was evident as she processed the challenge before her. Counselor, while I appreciate the thoroughness of your analysis, Morales involved questions of executive privilege in a regulatory context, not the specific statutory questions before us today. It was exactly the response Crockett had anticipated and prepared for. Your Honor, you addressed that very distinction in Morales as well, she replied, turning to page 4 of her document. On page 42 of your opinion, you specifically wrote that whether the executive action arises from regulatory authority, statutory interpretation, or inherent constitutional power, the principle remains constant. Established judicial precedent cannot be overridden by novel executive interpretation. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances of professional appreciation. This wasn't just effective advocacy. It was a masterclass in thorough preparation. Crockett had anticipated the judge's likely responses and prepared precise, irrefutable counters using the judge's own words. Social media was erupting. Legal commentators who had predicted a quick ruling were now broadcasting to their followers that something extraordinary was unfolding. Law professors were already telling students this would be required viewing in their courses next semester. The fourth parallel, Crockett continued, maintaining her methodical pace, concerns the standard of review. In Morales, Your Honor established that when fundamental questions of judicial authority are at stake, the court must apply the most stringent standard of review regardless of what standard the executive suggests is appropriate. With each parallel, the legal trap grew more complete. Judge Cannon now faced a profound judicial dilemma: rule consistently with her own established principles or explicitly abandon them for this particular case. The fifth parallel addresses the question of timing. Crockett proceeded, never accelerating her careful analysis despite the growing impact of her presentation. In Morales, Your Honor rejected the argument that expedited executive interest justified abbreviated judicial consideration. You wrote that the judiciary's obligation to fully consider established precedent cannot be circumvented by assertions of urgency from the executive branch. The courtroom remained silent except for Crockett's measured voice and the occasional sound of pages turning as Judge Cannon reviewed the document before her. Your Honor, Crockett said, shifting to the sixth parallel, in Morales, you specifically addressed attempts to distinguish precedent based on political context. Your opinion states clearly that attempts to distinguish controlling precedent based on the political context rather than legal principles undermines the foundational concept that ours is a government of laws, not political expediency. For the first time, Judge Cannon set down her pen, her full attention now focused on the attorney before her. This was no longer routine legal argument. It was a profound challenge to judicial consistency that could not be dismissed without significant consequences for the court's credibility. And finally, Your Honor, Crockett said, arriving at the seventh parallel, Morales addressed the very question of whether a court should defer to executive interpretation when that interpretation contradicts the court's previous application of the law. You wrote, and this is perhaps most directly applicable to our present circumstance, judicial integrity requires courts to apply legal principles consistently regardless of which party stands to benefit. To do otherwise would transform the judiciary from a neutral arbiter of law to a situational ally of political expediency. The final quotation landed with particular weight, not as an attack, but as a principled reminder of Judge Cannon's own articulated judicial philosophy. The trap was now complete. Either maintain consistency with her established principles or explicitly abandon them in a highly visible proceeding. The silence that followed wasn't empty but charged with the collective recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred. Judge Cannon, to her credit, didn't attempt to dismiss or minimize the challenge before her. After several moments of consideration, she spoke with the measured tone of a jurist confronting a legitimate legal dilemma. The court will take a 30-minute recess to review these precedents in detail. She announced, Counsel, I appreciate your thorough preparation in bringing these parallels to the court's attention. As Judge Cannon rose and left the bench, the courtroom erupted in hushed conversation. Legal analysts were already describing the moment as unprecedented and a masterclass in legal preparation. Social media was flooded with clips of the exchange, accompanied by commentary from legal experts explaining the extraordinary nature of what had just transpired. Jasmine Crockett remained at the lectern for a moment, calmly organizing her materials before returning to her seat. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. The power of thorough preparation had accomplished what emotional appeals never could. It had forced a judge to confront the inconsistency of applying different legal standards to identical questions based on the identity of the parties involved as the courtroom, buzzed with speculation about what would happen when proceedings resumed. One thing had already become clear. This was no longer about winning or losing a single motion. This was about whether judicial principles would be applied consistently regardless of political implications. A question that went to the heart of what it means to have a judiciary governed by law rather than expediency. When Judge Cannon returned to the bench after 35 minutes, 5 minutes longer than announced, the courtroom fell immediately silent. Legal observers noted a subtle but significant change in her demeanor. The earlier certainty had been replaced by the more measured expression of a jurist who had engaged in serious judicial consideration. Before the court rules on the pending motion, Judge Cannon began, her tone deliberately formal. I want to acknowledge Congresswoman Crockett's thorough analysis of the parallels between this case and United States versus Morales. The acknowledgement itself represented an extraordinary departure from normal judicial procedure, a federal judge explicitly recognizing the impact of an attorney's argument on her deliberative process. The court has reviewed the Morales decision alongside the present case, she continued. While there are factual distinctions, as there always are between cases, The legal principles I articulated in Morales regarding judicial consistency and the relationship between executive authority and judicial precedent are indeed relevant to our current proceeding. Legal analysts in the gallery exchanged glances of amazement. This was not merely a judge changing direction. This was a judge explicitly acknowledging the legitimate challenge to consistency raised by counsel. Judicial integrity requires intellectual honesty, Judge Cannon stated, her words measured and deliberate. When presented with evidence that application of legal principles may be inconsistent across cases, a judge has the obligation to ensure that such inconsistency is based on meaningful legal distinctions rather than other considerations. The I's statement, which would later be quoted in law review articles examining judicial ethics, represented a remarkable moment of judicial self-reflection prompted by Crockett's methodical presentation. Having reviewed the 7 parallels identified by counsel, Judge Cannon continued, "I find that the distinction between Morales and our present case is not sufficient to justify applying contradictory legal principles. Therefore, I am reversing my preliminary conclusion and will apply the standard I established in Morales consistently to the present case." The impact was immediate and seismic. Reporters frantically typed up dates capturing the historic reversal. Legal commentators who had predicted a routine ruling scrambled to explain the extraordinary turn of events. Judicial consistency began trending alongside Shakar-Crockett effect. What made the moment particularly remarkable was that it didn't represent the typical adversarial win seen in courtroom dramas. This was something more profound, a moment where thorough preparation and principled advocacy had led a judge to voluntarily ensure consistency in her application of legal principles. The judiciary at its most intellectually honest based on the Morales standard. Judge Cannon proceeded, "The executive's novel interpretation cannot override established judicial precedent where questions of separation of powers are at stake. Accordingly, the motion is denied. The ruling would have significant legal implications, but the process by which it was reached had even greater significance for public confidence in judicial integrity." As Judge Cannon continued to detail the specific applications of the Morales principles to the current case, legal observers were already describing the proceeding as a watershed moment for judicial accountability, not through confrontation, but through methodical demonstration of legal inconsistency. In keeping with the principle articulated in Morales that judicial integrity requires courts to apply legal principles consistently regardless of which party stands to benefit, Judge Cannon concluded, "This court finds that the same standard must apply in the present case despite the different political context." When the ruling was complete, the gallery remained momentarily silent, processing the extraordinary sequence of events they had just witnessed. It wasn't just that the outcome had changed. It was that they had seen the judicial system working exactly as it should. A well-prepared attorney identifying inconsistency, a judge seriously considering the challenge, and legal principles being applied consistently regardless of political implications. As the court adjourned, legal analysts were already framing the proceeding as a case study in effective advocacy, not through emotional appeals or political pressure, but through meticulous preparation and precise application of a judge's own articulated principles. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Crockett, shouting questions about her strategy and preparation. Her response would later be used in law school classrooms nationwide. "I simply took Judge Cannon's judicial philosophy seriously enough to believe she would want to apply it consistently. Thorough preparation isn't about winning at all costs. It's about ensuring that legal principles are applied with integrity regardless of which party stands before the court." The statement perfectly captured what had made the moment so powerful. This wasn't an attack on judicial authority. It was a demonstration of profound respect for judicial integrity paired with the expectation that such integrity requires consistency. Within hours, the impact had spread far beyond the specific case. Legal organizations across the political spectrum issued statements supporting the principle of judicial consistency. Bar associations highlighted the proceeding as an example of how attorneys can effectively hold the judiciary accountable through substantive legal argument rather than political pressure. A prominent legal commentator on CNN perhaps best captured the significance. What we witnessed today wasn't just good lawyering. It was a reminder of how the system is supposed to work. Crockett didn't attack the judge. She simply held up a mirror to the judge's own principles and asked for consistency. And Judge Cannon, to her credit, took that challenge seriously. The moment had transcended the typical adversarial framework of winning and losing. It had become instead a powerful example of how thorough preparation can serve not just a client's interest, but the integrity of the legal system itself. The ripple effects from the courtroom confrontation spread rapidly through legal and civic circles, transforming from a notable legal exchange into something more profound. A case study in judicial accountability and the power of thorough preparation. Law schools across the country requested the transcript for inclusion in their trial advocacy programs. Within 24 hours, 3 prestigious law reviews had commissioned special editions examining the implications of the exchange for judicial ethics and consistency. The American Bar Association announced a forthcoming panel titled Preparation as Accountability, the Crockett Method and Judicial Consistency. But perhaps the most significant impact came from how the event transcended typical political divisions. Legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum found rare common ground in praising both Crockett's methodical approach and Judge Cannon's willingness to prioritize legal consistency over other considerations. A conservative legal organization issued a statement noting that while we may disagree with the outcome, the principle that judges should apply legal standards consistently, regardless of who stands before them, is fundamental to the rule of law. Meanwhile, progressive legal groups emphasized how the case demonstrated that accountability doesn't require attacking institutions. It requires holding them to their own highest standards. Major news organizations moved beyond reporting the specific ruling to analyze what they were calling the Crockett Method, an approach to legal advocacy focused on thorough research of a judge's complete record to identify inconsistencies between established principles and current application. CNN's legal analyst described it as revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of attacking the judge, she simply presented the judge with her own words and reasoning, creating a choice between consistency and explicit contradiction of previously established principles. In her district office the following week, Crockett found herself sorting through thousands of messages from law students, practicing attorneys, judges, and ordinary citizens. A note from a federal appellate judge particularly stood out. In 30 years on the bench, I've seen countless attorneys argue that courts should rule in their favor. Rarely have I seen an attorney so effectively demonstrate why a court should remain consistent with its own principles, regardless of outcome. You've performed a service not just for your client, but for judicial integrity. Law schools reported what professors dubbed the Crockett effect. A surge in applications from students citing the case as inspiration for pursuing legal careers focused on substantive advocacy rather than performative confrontation. She showed that the most effective way to hold institutions accountable is to take their stated principles seriously and expect consistent application, wrote a first-year Harvard law student in the school newspaper. That's a model that transcends political divisions. The case had triggered something remarkable in contemporary discourse, a substantive conversation about institutional integrity that brought together voices typically separated by ideological chasms. Even Judge Cannon herself contributed to the discussion. In a carefully worded speech at a judicial conference the following month, without specifically mentioning the case, she addressed the importance of judicial consistency. The strength of our system depends not on judges being infallible, but on our willingness to ensure that legal principles are applied with consistency regardless of the parties or political implications. When we fall short of that standard, we should welcome the opportunity to correct course. That acknowledgement from the very judge whose consistency had been challenged transformed the moment from a courtroom victory into something more lasting. A case study in how the legal system can self-correct when presentation of inconsistency is made with precision and respect for judicial principles. Legal clinics across the country began implementing what they called consistency advocacy training. Law students to research judges' complete records to identify core principles and ensure their consistent application regardless of political context. Media analysis identified several key elements of what was now commonly called the Crockett Method. Thorough research of a judge's complete record, precise citation of the judge's own articulated principles, respectful presentation of inconsistencies, and framing accountability as fidelity to establish judicial philosophy rather than as external criticism. The Georgetown Law Journal devoted its entire fall issue to examining the implications with the lead article titled "Preparation as Democratic Accountability: How Thorough Legal Research Serves Judicial Integrity." The article concluded, "While our system provides structural checks on judicial power, Crockett demonstrated that the most effective everyday check may be simply taking judges' principles seriously enough to expect their consistent application." But perhaps the most significant legacy emerged in how ordinary Americans began to evaluate judicial decisions. Cable news producers reported that viewers increasingly asked not just whether they agreed with rulings, but whether judges were applying principles consistently across cases regardless of the parties involved. In her congressional office, Jasmine Crockett maintained her focus on constituent services and legislative responsibilities. When asked by a colleague about her approach to the now famous case, she replied with characteristic directness, "I just did what any good attorney should do. I took the judge's principles seriously enough to research them thoroughly and expect their consistent application." That's not extraordinary. It's just thorough preparation. That approach, substance over spectacle, preparation over performance, had not just changed the outcome of a single case. It had provided a template for how citizens in a democracy can hold institutions accountable, not through attacking them, but through taking their stated principles seriously enough to expect consistency. Law professors, political scientists, and civic educators would continue studying the exchange, identifying it as an example of how democratic accountability functions most effectively, not through undermining institutions, but through insisting they adhere to their own highest standards. For the millions of citizens who followed the case, the message was both simpler and more profound. Preparation matters. Consistency is essential to integrity. And sometimes the most effective way to hold power accountable is to take its principles seriously enough to expect their faithful application in all circumstances, regardless of who benefits. If you found value in this examination of how thorough preparation can ensure judicial consistency, please like and subscribe. With your support, we can continue highlighting moments when accountability works through reinforcing institutional integrity rather than undermining it. In a polarized age, the Crockett method reminds us that taking principles seriously enough to expect their consistent application may be our most powerful tool for ensuring that our system remains one of laws rather than expediency.